discussion is going on, and I'm hoping that that discussion will be fruitful, and those lists will be actually...
5,000 rupees enough?
It's like this. If you could afford more, you should be giving more, because actually 5,000 rupees is generally calculated as the minimum intake of calorie per person per month. But if you think of a family of 4, then it needs to be 20,000 rupees. You see, so that's the individual amount, but actually the average family has close to 4 people, so that you need about 20,000 rupees a month.
The next question is, can the government afford it?
There is a big challenge there, because government ultimately can meet its expenditure in 2 ways. One is revenue, and the other is borrowing.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the big mistakes that this government did on assuming office, right, a big mistake, is that this government came and reversed the tax policy that our government initiated.
Right.
Actually, our government, after it was elected in 2015, right, it got its act together, right, by about 2017, and realized that...
that's a bit contentious, but, I
would say on the macroeconomy. I'm not claiming it for everything, because we'll analyze the macroeconomy, right. It was a difficult situation, difficult road, because the global economy was slowing down, like in the earlier period. In the earlier period, you had growth rates in China of 10%, in India of 8%.
And in
Sri Lanka grew between 5 and 7% during that period. And you had the high growth rate, so the Asian growth rates were high, and Sri Lanka tagged on to the higher growth rates. Then the world economy slowed down in the next period, right? But the Sri Lankan economy growth rates came down as well, and we were certainly lower than India and all, and that was one of the negatives on our growth rate. But on the macroeconomy, the budget deficit, right, was trending down, inflation was trending down, revenues were trending up, and if you looked at international ratings, they were stable to positive, the international ratings. So the macroeconomy, and for the first time in 63 years, 2017 and 18, we even had a primary surplus that had been posted. So the reason I said that is, you are building it, like if you take revenue, we had 10.5% of GDP as revenue, which is very low given the per capita income that we had, right? And then what we did is, we raised it gradually to 13.5. It should be closer to 20, to 13.5. What the government came in and did it as it came in is, it's reversed the tax policy, and I estimated at that time that the tax revenues would have come by about 25% at least. That's the estimation. My feeling now is that it's going to be a much higher figure.
Yes, unfortunately, the government, they changed their policy, but in terms of tax and so on, and I don't think that anyone expected this, obviously, the COVID. So we've got almost a double whammy.
You're right. On the expectation thing, I might comment like this, Shaukat. Yes, certainly lay people like myself may not have expected it, right? But I think the people in the know, the specialists, it's like we see economic science coming, and I can see the economic science over the next year. I think the people in the field, right, realized it, because there were early warnings from the WHO and so forth around November, right, that this may be. Governments around the world were becoming aware of it. The leader of the opposition, Sajith Premadasa, actually, amazingly, he raised this in January in Parliament and in the first week of February. When nobody else, including me, hadn't talked about the coronavirus in Parliament. He actually raised it.
But he did go to the LSE.
So anyway, the issue is that the fact that he was so timely, and there was a delay of about a month before actually we went into action as a country in actually tackling the coronavirus. So I think the government did the right thing, the logical thing at the beginning. It wanted to flatten the curve, right? Because if you flatten the curve, you're trying to make sure that the medical services are there to meet it.
You can't have them challenged. For example, at the time, there was only about 10 beds for ICU patients at the infectious diseases hospital, and the other 2 as well, IDH and the other 2. So that you can't, even right now, this figure is just about manageable, because if you go by China's example, their experience was that 5% needed ICU treatment. But Italy's experience was between 16 and 20%. Even if you took the lower figure of 16%, Sri Lanka will face a challenge if this figure goes up much higher than this, which is why we need to make sure that medically we follow all these rules about staying indoors, keeping a distance, so on. But let's look at the economy. What is now what is available to be done? For example, I don't want to make this political, but in January 2015, the exchange rate was 131 rupees to the dollar, and today it's 193. When President Rajapaksa II, Gota, took office, it was around 180, 182, something like that. So they already inherited a challenging situation, and now this has made it worse. What's done is done. What needs to be done, the way forward?
Yeah, so as I said, the government definitely has a challenge. It's a global challenge.
Yeah.
I was telling you about the previous period, and one of the things in the previous period was also that you had a balance of payments which was positive.
Yeah.
You see, and now going forward, if you look at those indicators, right, revenue is going in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
The budget deficit will widen, right, and with the measures for quantitative easing by the central bank over time, after a while, inflation will begin to rise, the rupee will depreciate, right, your exports are going to be down, your remittances are going to be down, your tourism is going to be down, which means your balance of payments is also going to be in the negative. So this is the picture that's going to emerge over this year. It's a very, very negative picture. And the question is to figure out what are we going to do about this. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is, right, while the coronavirus is a flu and a virus, and scientists are very heavily at work, I would imagine, just reading the literature, that it would probably take maybe at least 12 months before a vaccine of some kind is available in the market. You see, that people could vaccine themselves. So we're going to have a turbulent year, and the question is, how are we going to actually adjust to it?
Indeed.
Now
because like, for example, let's look at one of the few things that are working is the tea exports. But again, that has been hugely challenged. People who booked forward purchase of dollars at, say, 180 are now finding this scenario where it's 193, right, and perilously getting close to the 200 mark. That's a big challenge.
There are two sides to that, Shaukat. Thank you for a good cup of tea.
Yes, indeed.
As I walked in. There are two sides to that, right? On one side, what the depreciation of the rupee does is, it makes your exports more competitive, it makes your imports more expensive. So it does not necessarily, if you take the economy as a whole, work against you, not necessarily. But the question here this time is, these standard measures won't work for the reason that every country is facing this, and if every competitor is depreciating it, you don't really have an advantage. Normally you have an advantage when things are, there is some line and you are depreciating below that line, then you have an advantage. So that basic fundamental issue is there. So standard prescriptions like fiscal stimuluses and things like that, I think that those will work at a particular point in time. Because the economic issue here is not a demand-driven issue, it's a supply-driven issue. Typically, you have financial crisis which is demand-driven. So you do things like you give tax rebates or you lower taxes and some stimulus to put money in the hands of people. So they go and either consume or they invest, and you get the economy going. And I think a time will come for that to work.
Indeed.
But I think we have a more fundamental issue immediately. The more fundamental issue is a supply-side issue in the economy, right? We have an issue where, right, people don't have their supplies coming. So if you are manufacturing or providing something or the other, there are supplies that you need to be connected in the supply chain. So you need to try to smoothen that out.
Right.
Now, one good sign is that China seems to be fast normalizing, which is a good sign, because if the Chinese economy and the US economy in some way stabilizes or picks up,
Yeah.
small countries like us will immediately have the benefit of it. So that's one. So the supply chain. The other is the logistics,
Yeah.
right? And we have to keep our logistics moving. Some of it is moving. The Colombo port is working, right? The logistics has some issues and problems,
Yeah.
right? Still, right? And then we have to have the local logistics working. So then the supply, the logistics. And the third important factor is that people have to basically go to work, particularly on production and manufacturing, and then some of the services. Now the challenge here, why the medical experts and the macroeconomists need to be in a discussion is, on one hand, right, we have social distancing, which we must maintain to
Indeed.
make sure that we bring the virus under control,
Yeah.
like the distance between you and me.
Indeed, look, we're keeping our meat well apart, a meter away, okay?
Yeah.
And then we've got the very good bottle of hand sanitizer, which I'm going to use, because you keep doing this, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, and you're
Thank
free
you.
to
Thank you. Yeah, so
do this. So we need to do this.
yeah, so what I say, the social distancing needs to
Yeah.
be maintained for
Yeah.
sure. So we will have to go, Shaukat, from a situation of curfew to limited lockdown,
Right.
to actually changing lifestyles.
Indeed.
Right? We have to go in that direction because the economy can kill us,
Yeah.
and if the economy fails, health will certainly fail. So there is a balance here, right?
Yeah.
A balance which has to be very carefully worked out. I happened to be visiting the Pradeshia Lekam, the divisional secretary, last week. I went to a few of these divisional secretariat offices to see what the issues were, you know, how can we help and so forth. And I was sitting there and talking with her. It was in Rakmalana, and she was interrupted by a phone call. And after the phone call, I said, "What's on?" And she said, "Oh, somebody's complaining that a factory has started somewhere." So I immediately just told her, obviously the police can go and look at the regulation side of it, but I told her, we need to really check what that factory is. I told her immediately, because I said some factories, manufacturing and some services need to go on, because that will kill more people, right, than the virus if they're not functioning.
It's like these things.
That's
They're
right.
sanitizers.
That's
Everybody
right.
needs them.
And it's very strange. Yesterday, I didn't ask her who it was and all, because that was not my business. My issue was just to raise the issue with her to make her conscious of it. And yesterday I found out that it was a medical supplier.
Right. Okay.
And I was so glad I had said what I had said, because the medical supplier just happened to be speaking to me right on the phone and said, this is what happened. And I said, strange that I was there when the phone call came and the complaint. And I'm glad that you are supplying the medicine, because we need it. So we have to move from curfew to limited lockdown, and finally lifestyle changes, and this will be for a whole year, the lifestyle changes. We can't just get away till the vaccines are there and things normalize and all that.
But how do you envisage our factories and our manufacturing?
Yeah, so
we need to get our farmers, and we need to become self-sufficient in the food supply, and so on.
Yeah. So in agriculture, Shaukat, where the farming itself is concerned, the social distancing is much easier. The issue that really comes in is in actually harvesting and in marketing and distribution. One is a social distancing problem arises there, because everybody converges on a market, right, and that issue is there, and they'll have to figure out how they will handle that issue. And the distribution issue, because if you are watching your station even last night, right, I saw they were focusing on markets and how people can't get their produce and agricultural produce. Yesterday, in particularly, you also focused on it, on agricultural produce not moving, and so there is a distribution issue, more than a production issue there in agriculture, and the production should be encouraged.
But there is also a knock-on effect, because if those farmers can't sell their products, then how are they themselves going to survive?
That's right. So certainly government has a responsibility in actually looking at that and seeing how that could be buffered, because the supply chain could keep going. Fortunately, we are fortunate by nature that the climate and that we can actually produce lots of food in this country to be self-sufficient in all the basics, that it could be done, and that should be encouraged and that should be protected.
Yes, it makes me sad though that we had to have something like COVID-19 to be the magnifying glass, because you can now see how much it has really cost all of us in terms of facilities and so on, if only the corruption levels were at least minuscule compared to what they have been. It is shocking that Sri Lanka's, let's take a look at the health system, since independence and up to today, let's go to the beginning of March, 580 ICU beds in total. That is shocking. We're talking about national, private, everything. 580. That is shocking. Then we're talking about, let's look at the power sector. Since independence, since the late 90s, the early, say, from 2000, look at the amount of money that has been paid for so-called standby power or emergency power. Some people have been made billionaires out of this, but at whose cost? At your cost, the people's cost. Because on average, around $7 million at one stage in the early 2000s was paid to just one company for emergency power. If there was forward planning, if there was no corruption, they could have had plenty of mobile power sets all throughout the country, located at strategic places, and it would have cost them a fraction. Even to this day, we don't have them in any great number, and that is shocking. So my point is that if, with all this corruption and the wastage, the wanton wastage, if we had controlled that, we would be in a far better position today.
Yeah, Shaukat, I can't disagree with you, right? And when I look at these issues, Shaukat, I look at actually we had to fix the system, right? And the system that we had to look at fixing it is, we have an executive, we have a parliament, we have a judiciary. All these should be basically working one independently of the other. Corruption is there, and generally the people who are corrupt are the people who have power, and there is of course retail corruption as well.
Yeah.
So how do they get checkmated? They have to get checkmated by the judiciary, right? There's no question about it, right? And we must strengthen the judiciary. It is very unfortunate that we had the situation of an individual recently being pardoned, right? A situation where
Absolutely.
where the Supreme Court of the country, just last year in 2019, I didn't really focus on the case till this issue came up. I read in 2019 the Supreme Court, 5 judges on the bench had unanimously basically upheld a verdict, and in 2020...
to be fair, I read that verdict too.
Yeah.
They dismissed certain parts, the unlawful assembly part of it, and they convicted this person for murder. And they upheld that portion of the judgment in May 2019.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that we mustn't take any steps that weaken the judiciary of the country, because the judiciary is one pillar of good governance. Because the issue we are raising on corruption is a governance issue, right? And the judiciary must be strengthened all the time, and judges must be able to freely interpret the law and give their verdict. And I think that's a fundamental issue. And the other mix we have in this country is that, Parliament's primary role is legislative, Parliament's role. And why we get mixed up is because Parliament over a long period of time, since this constitution is gradually being transformed as a part of the executive arm of government. So then when people look at Parliament, they look at it as a part of the executive arm of government and say, look at how Parliament is actually functioning. And actually there is a problem there, because then they look at individuals and they see corrupt individuals there. And unfortunately what's happening, Shaukat, is then an opinion begins to grow, and opinion is sometimes promoted, right, in certain sections of the media, that you really don't need a parliament, right? And we are making this mistake again, right? Parliament is absolutely needed for legislation, and parliament is needed for financial oversight, not for executive functions, right? And that's the role parliament must play. Then what do? We go as citizens, we vote people in, we send the wrong people sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And then we expect a better result,
Yeah.
right? In a democracy, right, people must also send the right people, and parliament must play its proper role. So if parliament is the check and balance on executive power, you see, parliament evolved, right, under the British system, because they had a king who was sovereign, right, and then to checkmate the king, they said, right, we'll have a parliament, no dollar or no pound will be raised, right, without the approval of the representatives of the people. In France, there was a revolution against the royal family.
All that's fine, because, but in Sri Lanka, we have some very dodgy things that going on that impinges on democracy. For example, the principal amongst these dodgy things is the ability of elected members of parliament to cross over to the other side. And usually it's to do with that, you know, or things connected with that, like fancy cars, fancy things, projects, whatever it takes. And unfortunately, it was also, in a convoluted sort of way, endorsed by the Supreme Court of this country. So, am I right? The opposition can say to you, well, look, come over this side, serve as a minister, and the Supreme Court ruling will stand in your favor. And that is one of the fundamental disasters to democracy in this country.
Yes, Shaukat, that as I am arguing, we need to fix a system. We can't depend on an individual's integrity only in putting a country right.
Yeah.
It's good if there are people of integrity who will stand by their principles, and that's what we must desire. But you're right, and therefore we missed an opportunity as well when we did the 19th Amendment.
Absolutely.
Right, when we did the 19th Amendment, because we knew that the Supreme Court had given a particular interpretation under particular circumstances, that we should have made sure, right, that if we came with a mandate, right, that we remained within that mandate basically, and didn't move out of that mandate.
Within that party, if you were elected from party A, you stayed in party A. And if you didn't want to, then you resign and then, you know, go for by-election or whatever it is.
So the rule of law is absolutely essential under any circumstance to make sure that there is good governance, the rule of law. And the sovereignty, right, of the people, right, i.e. which we call democracy, is absolutely essential. Sometimes when we are under a difficult situation, right, we are looking for a quick answer, and we sometimes, you know, just forget the law, forget regulation, forget this, forget that. And the long-term consequences that we will have to live under will be unacceptable. That is why, right, particularly as opposition, we must support the government completely in assisting with the coronavirus. I think that additional resources are needed, particularly for people working in the health fields, and they have been making certain demands. I think those should be met, right, and we should approve all the finances that are required to meet those needs.
When you talk about finances, and it is reflective of several messages I've received this morning, and what they're saying is that isn't there a real case now for the people who have robbed money from our country, from the people, to be hauled up and, you know, almost a la MBS in Saudi Arabia, where they locked them up and said, look, you pay, in short, you return. No, you're not paying for your release, but you return the monies that you've, you know, sort of misappropriated from the system. And otherwise, we're going to lock you up. There's billions probably out there. And is there a real case for that?
Shaukat, sometimes, you have the temptation to say, yes, we should just take people, lock them up, and so forth.
Yes.
I am opposed to that, right?
Because we live in a democracy?
No, because of the rule of law. The rule of law is absolutely important.
Right.
Now we had a situation recently of Sri Lankan Airlines, and some arrests were made.
Yeah.
We had the situation of the...
They're out on bail, by the way.
That's right. Then we
In
had,
between all this, they're out on bail.
right, and then we had the situation of the MiG transaction and Udayanga Veeratunga being
He's out on bail too.
extradited and brought here. But I would still argue, Shaukat, that all these people, just not just those two cases only, there are lots more cases, as you have always spoken on this channel, all those cases, right, must be tried within the law.
Are you a wagering man?
Huh?
Do you want to do a wager with me, a bet?
Yeah.
I'm betting
Yeah.
that in between all this, and when this all sort of is sorted out, when we meet again, as Her Majesty the Queen said last night, when we meet again, I don't mind betting that those people involved in that Sri Lankan Airlines thing and so on will be nowhere to be found.
Shaukat,
That's the level of my pessimism
Yeah.
when it comes to real investigation and real accountability.
Yeah.
And it does cheese everybody off.
Yeah, I can understand your frustration, right? But I think there's a difference between you and me. I am the born optimist, okay? And I have a reason for saying that. I can understand your pessimism because, right,
Because it's backed by so much of precedent, if you like.
That's correct. That's correct. And I think that this country, like the rest of the world, is going to change. The coronavirus is going to change. There's going to be a new world economic order. There's going to be a new order in this country. I actually believe that. It's a matter of time. It won't happen overnight, Shaukat, but it will be. Right? We have to have leaders, right, in this country, right, who there is no question about their integrity or the integrity of their families. You have to have leadership like that. As long as you don't have leadership like that, these issues are going to happen. I think a time is going to come in this country that the younger generation, the next generation to ours, right, are seeking for that. They are looking for a change, right? They're looking for a change. They're looking for the rule of law. They are looking for a country in which all citizens, irrespective of their race, their religion, their caste, are treated equally. What does happen in a crisis, Shaukat, is this. There's another angle to this.
Yeah.
What happens in a crisis is you look for a scapegoat. This happened in Europe, right? It happened in Europe 300-400 years ago, right, where the Christian majority persecuted the Jews, and sometimes it was related to plagues and things like that which came,
Yeah.
in there. And in countries like that, this danger is also there, that
Yeah.
you use opportunities like this to create racial or religious tensions, right, for political gain. We have to have leadership about that, right? One reason that Germany is succeeding in their fight against the coronavirus, right, and as you can see, their death rates are lower than most of the West, right, is that one reason is that the German population has absolute faith in their government and in the Chancellor of Germany. These are important factors, right? These are important factors, right? So that is why, Shaukat, I tend to differ from you. I can understand the frustration. I can understand that we may not have very quick results, as you are saying, but I think the day is going to come when people are going to say, we need new kinds of leadership in this country who are going to actually stand up to all of this corruption. Let the judiciary function independently. We will not reverse judicial decisions. Those are judicial decisions. We are the executive. We will take executive decisions. Let Parliament function independently. They have a legislative role. Let them play that legislative role. And the public have a responsibility that when they are given that vote, that they actually send suitable people to Parliament, not just educationally suitable, but also people who will stand up for ethical and moral values in Parliament. So while what I'm saying, from a pessimistic point of view is like, oh, I can never see that happen, I don't think that's true. I think it can happen in this country. There's a new generation of people who are thinking like that, and I think the day will come that it will happen.
Thank you, Vikramatna. Although I am reminded of what somebody, Samuel Johnson, said on the 7th of April, in the evening of the 7th of April in 1775, I think it was, and he said that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. And we need to tweak it slightly, because sometimes in this country, if you take out patriotism and replace it with democracy, a lot of people have been absolute scoundrels in the name of democracy. And as long as Sri Lanka can't address that issue, then I'm afraid that we are the people. When I say we, the people are doomed. But in the meantime, we must live in hope, and we will meet again, indeed. And all those people out there, many Sri Lankans, about 1 million people work in overseas markets, and quite a number of them are stuck in those countries, separated from their loved ones, their friends, their family, their children, their brothers and sisters. And we must think of everybody, but their time will come when those planes will be flying again, and that we will meet again. But in the meantime, we need to stay distanced to stay alive, basically, and we need to follow all the rules, but we will meet again. We feel terribly for all those people everywhere, separated from their families and friends, and we will meet again, will we not?
We will.
We will. Eran Vikramatna, thank you very much. On that note, that's the way it was on Newsline Live this morning. Take care. Have a safe and distant week ahead of you. And of course, in this we're all together. God bless.